Well, the title of my talk this evening is Places of Power and the Making of Anglo-Saxon Kingdoms, and the perspective that I'm going to be using to illuminate this topic relates to my ongoing excavations at Lyminge. They are actually ongoing. They weren't supposed to be. Last summer was the final of the 3 campaigns funded by the AHRC. But as every archaeologist knows, excavation breeds more questions, reveals things at the last minute, and we've managed to scrape together some additional funds, which means that we can do a targeted 4-week excavation in August this summer to tie up a very significant loose end that I'm going to be talking about later on. So I'll leave you hanging for a moment on that. I use the expression places of power in my title, and I think it's worthwhile just talking a little bit about the context, what I mean by places of power, specifically in the context of conversion period England. Now, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with the juxtaposition of Bamborough Castle, seat of the kings of Bernicia, Northumbrian Bernicia, and Holy Island Lindisfarne. These 2 sites are intervisible, and they express very neatly in physical terms the close relationship between royal power, royal places of power, and the earliest monastic foundations that we know about from documentary records such as Bede. Now, that twinning that I'm just showing you in that slide, of course, is perhaps one of the most dramatic cases of this kind of juxtaposition, but it's actually a relatively common one that can be seen across the English landscape. And that's what lies behind John Blair's quote here at the bottom. The normal relationship between royal residence and monastery was proximity rather than absolute contiguity. So this is based on his survey of various landscapes around Anglo-Saxon England. This is his characterisation of the relationship of newly founded monasteries to pre-existing centres of royal power, royal villas as they're known in the documentary sources. So what's particularly interesting about Lyminge as a case study is it presents some valuable new archaeological insights into that relationship. At Lyminge it's rather different. It breaks this dictum in that we do have a place where we do have absolute contiguity, or almost absolute contiguity, between a pre-existing royal centre and a newly established royal monastic foundation. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about is the nature of the relationship between those 2 discrete expressions of royal power in conversion period England. I just want to examine some of the sort of wider debates concerning Christianisation and its impact on Anglo-Saxon society and cultural landscapes. Now, this is a subject that traditionally has been approached by archaeologists through the mortuary record. We're used to archaeologists trying to track conversion through burials, particularly through the deposition of certain types of grave good. There are problems that we recognise through critical reflection on the way that we use archaeology to identify Christianisation. We're no longer as certain that we used to be that, for example, burial orientation is an accurate guide to changes in religious belief. And I haven't got time to go into the details of those debates. But I think one of the things we can say here is that Anglo-Saxon settlements, of which there are now a much greater number than there used to be, particularly as a result of commercial archaeology, are rarely brought into the academic arena and used as sources of evidence for exploring changes in devotional and religious practice during what was a period of considerable flux in cosmology, and religious and devotional practices. We're talking about the 6th and 7th centuries AD here. So I think there's a need to bring this greatly expanded source of data into the debates, to look at sort of how we can track changes in devotional practice, religious affiliation, in daily life contexts, as opposed to in death. I think we need to take a targeted approach here. We need to select sites where we have good historical documentation that allow us to explore this theme in an interdisciplinary manner. And of course this brings us back to monastic settlements themselves, which have been subject to, I think, some limitations. There have been some limitations and problems in the way that we previously investigated monasteries as central places, as important, significant settlements in their own right. Previous research has been characterised, I think, by a bias on core buildings, the architecture of the cult foci of these sites. An emphasis has been on keyhole glimpses. It's very difficult to gain a holistic impression of what these sites look like, their physical organisation and layout. Another consequence of this narrow keyhole approach is we have a very poor conception of the what came before perspective. Why were monastic sites established where they were? What was the nature of antecedent activity on these sites? That's another key area where we need better understanding. In terms of the archaeology itself, many of our key Anglo-Saxon monastic excavations, places like Glastonbury, Monk Wearmouth, Jarrow, of course have long schemes of investigation which date back to before the period where intensive sampling is used as a sort of a standard methodology on archaeological sites. So the knowledge we have in relation, for example, to the economy of these places, dietary regime, is very patchy because we've not collected the remains, the data, on a systematic basis. And I'm particularly talking about things like fishbone, small remains where you need things like flotation to capture the evidence. So the basic, I think, if there's an agenda here, is what we need to do is go back to some of our well-documented monastic sites and subject them to the level of intent and intensity of excavation that we're familiar with from Anglo-Saxon commercial excavations. Sites that are now, to early medievalists at least, now quite familiar. Places like Flixborough or Brandon, which some of you may have heard of, that has just very recently been published. A good place to start in terms of following this agenda, of course, is Kent. Of course, crucial to the earliest phases of the Anglo-Saxon conversion. As an early ecclesiastical province, it's relatively well documented, particularly for the sort of 7th and 8th centuries, which are periods that are historically very, very dimly illuminated in other parts of Anglo-Saxon England. And I just take a comparison of two key sources that help us understand and characterise the Anglo-Saxon Church in Kent. This is Whitchwood's Charter of 699 AD, reconfirming the privileges given to the early Kentish minsters. And beside that, we have Domesday Manicorum, which helps us to track how the ecclesiastical infrastructure developed over the Anglo-Saxon period and what we're left with just after the turn of the millennium. So we can see we have our key sites that are mentioned in both of these sources, and of course Lyminge is there amongst them. So if we take all these sources, and I haven't mentioned all the rich charter evidence that's recently been pulled together in the Anglo-Saxon Charter series by the late Nicholas Brooks and Susan Kelly, I'll be mentioning some of the individual charters of relevance during my talk. But we can draw out some characteristics or themes from the historical sources that survive. A notable concentration of double monasteries established on the Frankish pattern. Many of these places were centres of royal cults, of founding royal abbesses. Mildreth in the case of Minster in Thanet, Ethelberg or Ethelberger, depending on, Edberg or Ethelberger in the case of Lyminge. There's some debate over exactly which saints were venerated there, but it's a consistent pattern nonetheless. And the other key thing, I think, that we can draw out of the evidence is this pattern whereby these double foundations, these double houses, are attached to what appear to have been a stable network of royal villas that had crystallised in the Kentish landscape certainly by the end of the 7th century. And we can use various sources of evidence to see the emergence of these central places in the landscape, and I'm going to use Lyminge as a case study for that. So I'm not going to go into the details of all of these places. So then, just to sort of recap about the regional context here, well, what sort of perspective does Kent provide? Well, we've got evidence that for the long-term stability of royal centres in this region, that means if we excavate them, that can provide a perspective on monastic foundation as a dynamic process. How were long-established royal centres changed, altered, adapted as a consequence of having monastic foundations implanted in them? Do they become sort of quite complex, polyfocal, multifunctional sites, or does monastery replace pre-existing royal centre? How were long-established traditions relating to the culture of royal power adapted and changed under the impetus of these new monastic foundations and their underpinning Christian ideology? It can also provide us with a perspective on the double house as an early expression of the Anglo-Saxon church and monasticism. Of course, this is a model that's adopted in other parts of Anglo-Saxon England, not just Kent. And the other interesting perspective that we've got here is the examination of the Kentish church as a monastic network. All these places that I've just talked about from my previous map were established within a relatively short period of time. We know from charters and other sources that FSAs sometimes ruled more than one of these institutions simultaneously, and of course they're closely bound with the royal cult of the Kentish kings. So we should expect them then to perhaps share cultural traits, perhaps they shared infrastructure as well. How might that be expressed in the archaeological record? Today, I've only really got time to concentrate on those first set of questions. I'm not going to go so much into these other two. If we go back and examine previous work in Kent, we can see that it epitomises some of the problems that I mentioned in England as a whole. Most of the work was focused on the architecture of core churches in places like Canterbury, but also further afield in the hinterland of Canterbury. We know a certain amount about the development of the buildings in relation to the Augustinian mission. There's been very good work done on that, and that's quite advanced scholarship on that aspect. But what we don't know, or we have much poorer understanding of the wider context surrounding these buildings. And I include in that St. Augustine's, major questions. What was the layout of associated domestic occupation in its early phases? When do we first get emergent of anything like or approximating a claustral plan? These are fundamental questions that we can't answer because, because of the nature of past research, lack of opportunity in some cases. Sorry, that's just many of you might be familiar with Eric Cambridge's excellent article just re-examining the architecture of the Augustine mission as it's represented in Kent. But I want to go next forward and examine what Lyminge has to offer as a case study, or to put it another way, why Lyminge? Amongst the network of royal minsters that I showed you in a previous slide, why not somewhere else? Why has this particular site been selected? Well, first of all, just thinking about it as a case study, it's a very strategic point in the landscape. It lies about relatively close to one of the major Roman roads in Kent, connecting Canterbury with Portus Limanis, the Classicus Britannica fleet was based there. It became an important late Roman shore fort. This is what's known as Stone Street. So Lyminge is just located off Stone Street, and it's also, in terms of communication routes, it's nestled in a valley called the Elam Valley, which stretches from the escarpment of the North Downs, which is just here, up towards the catchment of Canterbury. There's a small river called the Nailbourne that flows north through that valley and then joins up with the Stour. So it funnels, it's a natural funnel, if you like, from the south coast up towards the regional capital of Canterbury. The other thing that it's got going for it is it's a source. It is the source of the River Nailbourne. It's a fresh supply of water, a spring here in the centre of the village. So for that reason, it's been very long occupied as a settlement. And in fact, our excavations have shown that in the valley, just skirting the source of the River Nailbourne, there's major activity in the Mesolithic period. So there's good evidence for long occupation within the village. Now, the key reason it's proved such a rewarding archaeological case study is it has large open areas available for excavation. And that immediately sets it apart from many other sites of sort of early royal stroke monastic sites in Kent, including places like Minster in Thanet and Sheppey. You can basically dig larger holes in Lyminge than you can in any other comparative site. And in fact, on this slide here, you can see our 2008 excavations in land just to the south of the church and churchyard. But what we've been doing over the last, since 2008, our first season of open area excavation, is systematically picking off these open areas within the core of the village. Why do these open areas exist? Well, it's a happy accident, really. When a railway was built in the Elam Valley in the 1880s, that had the effect of, if you like, sucking off the pulling or attracting the development of the village towards it, leaving the sort of old historic core largely unoccupied. I should say largely. There has been more modern infill in this part of the settlement. There's a large estate here built in the 60s and 70s, and also things like Lyminge Primary School, which went up in the 80s. That's somewhat problematic because it's right on the edge of our most recent campaign of excavations, but there is absolutely no evidence of anything being discovered there, which I find quite hard to believe, given the richness of the archaeology that we found on this site here. Of course, we weren't the first archaeologists to dip our toe into Lyminge as a site, and in a sense, we can't escape the legacy of this chap here, the Rector Canon Jenkins, a rector of the church in the 1850s and 60s. And to many of you who know Lyminge, it's probably his discoveries that you're familiar with. That's what's made Lyminge familiar in academic circles. Here we see just absolutely classic picture of a cleric scholar, Victorian cleric scholar. He was very, very knowledgeable when it came to the early charter sources and historical traditions that link Lyminge to Queen Ethelburga, daughter of King Ethelbert of Kent and widow of King Edwin. Ethelburga of Bede's narrative. She's mentioned in the ecclesiastical history. Supposedly, in 633, she was given land in Lyminge by her brother, King Adbald, on which to found a monastic community following her fleeing from Northumbria after the routing of King Edwin. That knowledge led him to undertake excavations just to the south of the present-day church, and he recovered a series of foundations, masonry foundations, which he published in a number of places over quite a period, actually. This is one of the plans, his interpretation plans from Archaeology Kantiana. Now, I don't have time to go into the sort of the detailed intricacies of what Canon Jenkins might or might not have found. There are problems with his interpretation as published, and the key problem that we've been grappling with is here all these sort of open parts of his plan here, the not bolded parts or shaded parts, are conjectural, and here we can see that he's conjectured on the basis of the masonry foundations that were uncovered a large basilical style structure that I think he was led by the use of the term basilica in the charters. Now, this was completely out of place in 7th century Kent. What we have got here is one of our early Kentish group churches with an apsidal east end, perhaps with a sort of a triple chancel arch on the basis of analogies. That's okay. Whether it had a porticus on this side, I don't know, that's open to debate. More problematic are these remains that are uncovered to the southwest of the tower, which he's used partly on the basis for this rather grand and somewhat anachronistic reconstruction. And there's been a lot of discussion about what these elements actually represent. And I don't think we're entirely sure. I think what we can now discount, however, is that, that this relates to a Roman bathhouse, which I think has been mentioned in the literature. There is no evidence for significant Roman occupation in Lyminge on any of the sites that we've excavated. There is no Roman centre in Lyminge, which is a very interesting fact in itself, but I think that's a nail in the coffin for this being some kind of a Roman structure on this site, and we can maybe open debate as to what it might represent later on in questions, but I have to move on. Significant archaeology had been discovered on the outskirts of the village in the 1950s, also relating to the Anglo-Saxon period, earlier than the remains recovered by Jenkins. Lyminge has two known Anglo-Saxon cemeteries. This one here, found in the 1950s, just to the north of the village, in advance of the construction of a mushroom shed. I don't think there are many mushroom sheds built nowadays. But about 50 or so graves discovered, including high-status 6th century examples. This is one of female burials dating to that period, with these characteristic garnet-inlaid brooches that are based on, they're heavily influenced by Frankish elite fashions, and also this lovely silver strainer. We still don't know what these were used for. And this quartz crystal ball suspended the suspension loop. So these sets, if you like, these suites of objects, including these characteristic quartz balls and strainers, are found in elite burials, female elite burials in Kent in the 6th century, and we're probably looking at religious practitioners here. That's the key significance of these items, although we don't know precisely how they were used. And not forgetting the name itself, the distinctive, the characteristic name, Lyminge. This is an early place name element. Suffix there, and that's telling us quite clearly, on monastic terms, that we're dealing with a territorial centre, the centre of a large territory that stretches down to Romney Marsh. That's where the lim element comes from. That relates to a branch, a coastal branch of the River Rother that was known as the River Lyminge in early sources, in the early charters. So we've got a place that exercises territorial centrality within this block of southeast Kent. So before the inception of our excavations in Lyminge back in 2008, this was what was known, previously known. And what we've been able to do in several seasons of open area excavation, as I hope to demonstrate, is to connect these various fragments together. to tell what I think is quite a powerful narrative of how an early medieval place of power or a central place evolves over time. It allows us to see monastic foundation as part of a longer-term process of change and adaptation in a place intimately connected with political and royal power. So I want to take you through that narrative and discuss what the archaeology, the underlying archaeological evidence for it. So I want to start off back in the late 5th and 6th centuries. And this is a period of archaeology that's represented in the lower lying portions of the village, which flank the source of the River Nailbourne. Here's the source, today capped by a wellhead, the well put in place by Canon Jenkins. This is one of his memorials to Queen Ethelberga. There's a nice plaque, dedicatory plaque, in the wellhead if you visit the village today. So we're in the lower lying portions of the village overlooking the source of the River Nailbourne, and in these areas we found some good evidence for occupation dating to this period, represented by a cluster of about 7 quite widely scattered sunken featured buildings, absolute classic structural type dating to this period, well represented not only in England but in the North Sea zone more generally. These are ancillary structures. You can see reconstructed examples if you visit Weststow in East Anglia. So these were originally, of course, back in the day, these were believed to be the hovels of Anglo-Saxons back in Leeds day. We now know that these are ancillary to ground level post-hole built halls. So we found a good cluster of these. What stands out, I mean, structurally they're very characteristic, but what stands out is what stood out from our earliest excavations of the sunken featured buildings back in 2010 was the richness of the cultural material dumped back into the abandoned pits. This is absolutely classic for the biography of these buildings in Anglo-Saxon England. They don't stand very long, maybe 30 or 40 years maximum. Then they're abandoned and dismantled, and then midden materials thrown back in. They're deliberately closed, and I think some archaeologists, including myself, believe there may be a ritual element to those closure events. And this is just a range of some of the cultural assemblages that were found in association with the closure of sunken featured buildings. And what particularly stood out from an early point in the excavations was the quantity of vessel glass coming out from these deposits. 5th and 6th century vessel glass, smashed fragments of vessels that one finds in high status graves dating to this period. This is the first time that a settlement has produced an extensive range of vessel glass dating to this period, and in fact the sherd count is now well in excess of 500, making it by far the most productive site for vessel glass in early Anglo-Saxon England. Now, last year's excavation, 2014, really brought some spectacular new evidence to light on this early period in Lyminge's Anglo-Saxon history. Here we are looking down. Sorry, I should just maybe contextualise that for you. We're looking across the 2014 excavation trenches, back towards the church. There's the church sitting proudly on top of a chalk spur. Most of the monastic phase archaeology, 8th and 9th, is all located behind the church, up on the higher reaches of that spur. We're in the bottom of the valley here. There's the River Nailbourne, the source just behind that willow tree. All the early stuff is down here. This is our main trench from last year. What we're looking at here is a Bronze Age barrow, previously unidentified. Interesting location. Archaeologists used to think that barrows were normally located on elevated sites. I think we're now revising that. That's just where they're most visible. think if you actually examine commercial archaeology that takes place in sort of valley locations, we're finding many more in this kind of topographic situation, i.e. low-lying, overlooking the sort of a river or a small watercourse. So we've excavated slots across the barrow, we've dated it. There are a cluster of Bronze Age cremations in the centre. Nothing particularly unusual about that as a Bronze Age monument. But what we can see very clearly is it's being used as a focus in the Anglo-Saxon period. What we're seeing here is actually a whole sequence of post-built halls that are overlapping the barrow mound. Good dating evidence from these. They're all 6th century. That sequence is 6th century in date. This kind of practice is now something that we recognise as being very common. We're particularly familiar with Anglo-Saxon cemeteries being focused on barrows like this, but increasingly we're seeing it in settlements as well. So this is a very good example. Now, I mentioned right at the beginning that one of the reasons we're returning this summer is to try and tie up a significant loose end. The loose end that I'm talking about is this thing just here on what is the south east of our Bronze Age barrow. This showed up as a very large geophysical anomaly, so we were expecting to encounter it, but what it turned into was rather remarkable and completely exceeded all of our expectations. In effect, what we're looking at here is a large crater about 14 metres long, 12 metres wide. That crater is filled with extremely rich 6th century midden deposits, including very concentrated lenses of ash and metalworking residues. Our initial method of excavating it was to sample it in squares like this to get a spatial control of artefacts coming up. We soon recognised that it would take us several years to excavate this feature using that methodology, so we abandoned it and we decided to excavate some transects through it, a mid-portion, to get a sense of how deep it was and what its sort of depositional history was. So we're looking down along that transect there. We're about 2 metres deep here, and these are these rich midden deposits. You can see that there's layers of burning in there as well. I'll talk about some of the material that we recovered from the midden layers in a moment. But what's extraordinary, and we don't have an answer for, I'd be very interested to hear what your observations on this. 2 metres down, so underneath all of these midden deposits, we encounter this thing here, which is a deliberately laid platform of flint nodules, quite coarse flint nodules. So it's not metaling, it's not something that you would necessarily want to stand on, it's too coarse for that. But having said that, it still could have been covered with some kind of organic material like rush matting and provided a solid base. We know that this isn't the bottom of the feature. We've cored and we've established that there's another 1.4 metres of deposition below this point here. So this is currently unknown as to exactly what this is doing, what its function was, what activities were taking place down at this level before all of these midden layers were deposited in the 6th century. So we don't know the origins of this feature. Is it prehistoric? Could it be contemporary or near contemporary with our Bronze Age barrow and then was later used as a focus for activity on the Anglo-Saxon settlement? Is it a natural feature? Is it some kind of a solution hollow that's being filled in the Anglo-Saxon period? Or indeed, is it Anglo-Saxon in origin? These are all questions that need to be answered for us to be able to write a definitive account of the development of the settlement, and that's why we're going back to sample more of it in the summer. But just to give you an idea of the quantity of material that's come out of those midden deposits, large quantities of vessel glass, other sort of classic type fossils of the period, beads. There are relatively few whole metal objects. The few that we have recovered are clearly of 6th century date. This is a nice little gilded mount with very early style 2 decoration, for those of you that are familiar with the periodization of Anglo-Saxon art. But lots of evidence for production of various kinds. I mentioned a few whole metal objects, but lots of fragments and knickknacks. There is definitely copper alloy working going on in Lyminge, represented by finds like this, both casting and sheet metal working, the production of composite objects. Here's some crucibles and moulds associated with the casting. But one of the major signatures that we have is iron working on an intensive scale, dominated by smelting, which is more of a specialised part of the iron working, far more specialised than iron smelting and secondary smithing. Also tantalising, got to do more work on this, we think we may have recovered traces of glass vessel manufacture in fragments of raw glass. So we're not just getting complete glass from complete vessels, we're also getting raw glass and what looks to be recycled Roman glass. The reason that this is significant is because Kent has long been argued to have been centre for the production of glass in the later 5th and 6th centuries, but purely on the basis of distribution. This is the first evidence, really, potentially the first evidence of actual production site. So we're undertaking the necessary analysis to be able to establish that, and will be in the next phase of the project. So there you are. These are the earliest phases. So we've got a scatter of sunken featured buildings, some post-built halls, evidence for production of various crafts, and I think conspicuous consumption in the 6th century. I haven't really talked about the animal bone assemblage up till now, but I'll be focusing on that a bit later. Then something dramatic happens in the 7th century. Within the limits of that occupation, early occupation that I've talked about so far, we see the construction of a suite, a complex of monumental timber halls, the likes of which we've previously seen at sites like Yeavering. These are very grand structures. They are large by contemporary standards. This is the hall, or the footprint of the hall that we excavated in 2012. It's about 21 metres long, 9 metres wide, with opposed entrances down the long walls. And it has a very characteristic type of timber construction involving planked walls, so parallel pairs of planks placed in continuous foundation trenches. This is an elite constructional style that characterises a select group of sites, royal sites, including Yeavering, and another well-known site would be Cowdrey's Down. But this is the first time we've seen this kind of elite architecture in Kent. And as I'll be showing you in a minute, there's some interesting Kentish twists. There's another fragment of another one of these large halls that we excavated last year. We won't be able to fully reveal its ground plan ever because there's a playground that's constructed over the top of it. But it's potentially larger than the one I've just shown you, maybe up to about 30 metres in length. 2013 was a fantastic excavation season, and it revealed a nice sequence of these halls, a cluster of them that replaced each other on overlapping footprints. That's why, so you can see that there are 3 distinct phases replacing each other. So this building is rebuilt on more or less the same site, and 3 episodes, but it gets bigger and more elaborate over time. And I just want to show you the sequence. So there are two earlier sunken featured buildings representing our 6th century phase. Phase 1 hall, Phase 2 hall, and then the most elaborate and largest, this one here. And I've marked out what were clearly very, very impressive monumental portals leading into this structure. It's one of the characteristic things about it. Here they are under excavation, these large pits with 3 metres long, 2 metres deep, very deeply founded. We can see the structural detail at the base here. So they dug a pit, and then the portals, which are very wide, these are wide planks, about 80 centimetres wide, placed towards the back edges of the pit, leaving a gap of about just under a metre sort of access into the building. I think there's no doubt that these portals would have been elaborately carved. Unfortunately, we can't see that in the archaeology. Another very significant aspect of these structures is that we have evidence for elaborate flooring. We have recovered fragments of opus signinum from various constructional features relating to the hall complex, not only this one, but other halls that we've excavated within this complex subsequently. And also plaster. So these in the interior of it, we believe it's most likely interior plaster, or sort of finished walls would have been interior with plaster. Now, opus signinum flooring isn't something that we found in association with halls of this type anywhere else in Anglo-Saxon England. Of course, we associate it with churches dating to the 7th and 8th centuries, including in Kent. I think this is really fascinating in illuminating the interplay between secular architecture, royal architecture, and secular expressions of that, and these Christianising influences that come through with the church. We haven't previously seen that, and we've got clear evidence, I think, for this emerging at Lyminge. We're also very fortunate in being able to have recovered cultural material alongside our halls, and this is unusual. Places like Yevering, they produce very, very small finds assemblages. It appears that these places were kept very clean. We don't find much rubbish within them. We've been lucky to get a reasonable haul of artefacts from these 7th century phases, and they're providing some really nice glimpses of the elite culture of the royal mead hall. So we're talking about feasting, we're talking about elaborate vessels, including this fragment here, which is only paralleled in princely burials of the 7th century, places like Pretty-well, Sutton Hoo, and this fantastic gaming piece that came from the foundation trench of one of 2013's hall. 2013, the hall's found in that season. This is a composite blade turn gaming piece, which would have been finished with copper alloy rivet. You can see that green staining there. This type of gaming piece, again, is only paralleled in a princely context. There was a set of these found at Taplow, at the early 7th century royal burial at Taplow. So incredibly lucky to get these glimpses. So here is well, it's not completely speculative, but reconstruction of what we think this complex would look like when it was standing in the mid-7th century. This was actually produced at the end of the 2000 season, and we need to alter that in some of the details. This hall is now bigger, but nevertheless, it gives you an impression. Now, what's fascinating about the sequence of Lyminge is that all that I've talked about so far was evidently swept aside by the end of the 7th century, and then effectively the settlement of Lyminge, or the royal centre or focus of Lyminge, was re-established. It was re-established on a new site, and our archaeology demonstrates that very clearly. And it must be, to my mind, linked powerfully with the establishment of a monastic community, which is well recorded in the historical documentation, and arguably represents an attempt to Christianise what had been a centre for pagan cult practices going back into the 6th century. Our earliest seasons of excavation, 2008 to 10, were located to the south of the churchyard in these regions. And all of the archaeology recovered from these sites was of the 9th century date, what archaeologists would call Middle Saxon in date. None of the earlier phases that I talked about. And contrastingly, we found nothing of this period in the lower lying reaches of the village. So there is a very clear spatial shift or redefinition in Anglo-Saxon Lyminge. The character of the archaeology up here is very different. We have things like boundary ditches. It's heavily pitted, lots and lots of rock-cut pits, very different to what you see in the earlier phases. And as I've argued in print, what this represents, I think, is an ordered spatial layout of domestic, agricultural and industrial activities in the outer precinct of the monastery. We have a series of zones that we're able to reconstruct through the archaeology. I don't have the time to go into the details, the minutiae of what the evidence is, but we seem to have small timber cells, not unlike those recovered at the site of Hartlepool, in our innermost zone, surrounded by lots of pits used for the disposal of human waste, kitchen waste, with clear domestic signatures coming out of those deposits, things like these lovely keys. So there's a very strong domestic feel to this part of the settlement. And lots of sort of dietary evidence, which I'll be talking about in a moment, coming up alongside those artefacts. Beyond this zone, we have an area that appears to have been used for agricultural processing. One of the pieces of evidence for this, I don't have time to go into the details here, is this rather sort of large structure, 20-metre long timber building that I think displays very good evidence for being used as a threshing barn. I'll just take a quote here from Helena Hamerow's recent synthesis of Anglo-Saxon settlements that talks about the 8th and 9th centuries being a period where we get the very first use of major storage facilities in relation to central places since the Roman period. And I think this is one of the best pieces of archaeological evidence that we have for this. And finally, but very importantly, right on the edges of the monastic precinct, we're about 120 metres northwest of the church. Geophysics showed up this high intensity anomaly up here. We trial trenched this area, and what we've shown is that we've got a site of a metalworking, ironworking, located out on this region, out on the periphery here, dated to the 8th and 9th centuries. And that fits in really nicely with one of our pieces of charter evidence for the Royal Villa at Lyminge having in its possession an iron mine. This is our earliest attested mineral extraction rights that we have in Anglo-Saxon England, a very early charter. It was gifted to St Augustine's, but what this evidence shows us that it was still functioning. Ironworking was still very important to the economy of Lyminge going into the 8th and 9th. So there's continuity there in terms of that part of Lyminge's economy, because of course we've got all the evidence for ironworking back in the 6th century as well. Because we've got all these rich deposits, and we've been able to gain a quite detailed perspective on changes of diet and animal exploitation over the occupation sequence. And we've tried to exploit this evidence as much as possible we've really sampled on an intensive basis, using methods like flotation. So we've got really extensive, what you call bioarchaeological assemblages, probably the largest assemblages for any site in Anglo-Saxon England. And because we're in a well-documented area, we can bring different perspectives to bear on Lyminge's economy and diet. So we can look at the charters, we can look at the evidence that provides, the importance of Romney Marsh in terms of its resourcing and resource networks. That's well established in the charter evidence, as is the Weald and Wealden resources as well. But we can now begin to see that in terms of patterns of consumption in Lyminge through the archaeology. One of the things that comes across really strongly is the importance of marine resources, as perhaps one might expect from the charters. But what the charters don't tell you is that there's really important and significant temporal shifts in the fishbone that we've recovered. So, just in a nutshell, what that's telling us is back in the 6th and 7th century, fish consumption is happening, but on a limited scale, and it's largely focused on inshore species that can be captured with fish nets and traps. When you move into the 8th and 9th centuries, the monastic phase, however, that completely changes, and it moves to much more to a fishing economy, much more focused on gaddids, large cod, and species that are taken by hook and line in boat. So these are more deep water species. So a complete shift in the marine economy as one moves into the monastic phase. We see similar or marked transformations in other species as well. So, for example, in our earlier phases, 6th and 7th century, pig is the commonest domesticate. And this ties in really nicely with charter evidence for woodland dens and the panning of pigs in those environments. You move into the 8th and 9th monastic phase, and everything changes. Pig drops right off to be replaced by the two things that really do take off in the 8th and 9th centuries are, first of all, sheep, but also alongside that, domestic fowl. So these are being farmed on a much more intensive basis as one moves into the 8th and 9th centuries. Now, of course, this is very interesting in the context of the establishment of Christian diet and the role of monastic communities in that. Lots of debate has been had on the extent to which in an early period monastic houses were following what we might think of as being a Benedictine rule, with quite strict dietary rules. There's ambiguity in the historical sources as to that, but I think the evidence from Lyminge would suggest that this is actually happening, and it's a reality of these monastic communities at this date. So I want to sort of draw things to a close with some observations, general observations that we can draw out of the Lyminge evidence. I think one of the most important things about it is that it allows us to view monastic foundation not as a single event, but a distinct phase in the drawn-out development of an Anglo-Saxon central place or place of power. Royal appropriation of this site was initially marked by the construction of what we call our Great Hall Complex, which was placed within a pre-existing core of a much earlier settlement, a settlement associated with a tribal centre with origins dating back to the 5th century. And I think we can see a similar thing happening at other sites, like Yevering, comparable sites like Yevering. Sutton Courtenay would be another parallel there. So it's something quite interesting that, the way that royal power is being expressed in the 7th century, it's not creating a completely new category of site. It's going back to pre-existing places. It's appropriating them, perhaps for symbolic reasons. We can see that monastic foundation had a major influence on the rhythms of daily life, going back to what I was talking about at the beginning, trying to bring settlement archaeology into the arena to see what sort of effects religious transformation had on the daily life, getting a daily life perspective on that. We've seen that we have a complete spatial redefinition of Lyminge around a new Christian core. And this is accompanied by a suite of transformations, major shifts in animal production and diet, placing much greater emphasis on coastal resources and fowl. And I think arguably here we're looking at the influence of Christian diet, certainly, and perhaps monastic food regulations. New technology and infrastructure associated with a centralisation of a state surplus. So here we can see monasteries taking a very active role in the process of agricultural intensification that we're beginning to recognise with greater and greater clarity across not only the English landscape, but the landscape of many European countries in this sort of 8th and 9th century period. Archaeology is really helping us to see that these processes happening at that time. And I think the final thing that I want to leave you with is that I think investigated on appropriate scale, sites in the category of Lyminge can make a really important, indeed seminal contribution to unlocking the detailed social dynamics behind the Anglo-Saxon conversion and the powerful role that places and performance played in negotiating those transitions. So I'll leave you with that one.